Whole wheat sounds like the safe bread. That is exactly why it works so well in the grocery aisle. Brown color, a wheat field on the bag, a soft slice, and the words whole wheat or whole grain can make a loaf feel finished before you even read the label. But the front of the bag is not the whole story. For older adults in the U.S. who are buying bread for toast, sandwiches, breakfast, or a simple meal, the real questions are usually much smaller and much more useful. What is the first ingredient? How much fiber is actually in the slice? How much added sugar is hiding in there? And how much sodium did the loaf need to stay soft and shelf-stable? Welcome to Golden Menu. Today we are looking at 9 popular whole wheat breads I would watch carefully if they were your everyday default, and 3 better picks that give you more honest grain logic. This is not medical advice. If you already have guidance from a doctor or dietitian for diabetes, blood pressure, kidney issues, heart disease, or anything else, follow that advice first. This video is a grocery guide for older viewers who want a better read on the bread aisle. And before we start, here is the shortest rule in the whole video. Do not trust color. Do not trust the word whole wheat by itself. Read the first ingredient. Check fiber against sugar. Check sodium against softness. If that sounds simple, good. It should be simple. Before we start, it is worth saying why this matters so much for older viewers. A lot of people over 60 are not choosing bread because they are excited about bread. They are choosing it because breakfast needs to be easy, lunch needs to be fast, dentures or sensitive teeth can make certain textures a problem, and nobody wants to turn every grocery trip into homework. That is exactly why bread labels can be so slippery. The loaf is quiet. The price is usually not dramatic. The bread sits in the same place every week. And because it feels ordinary, people stop asking whether it is actually helping the meal or just filling space on the plate. For this audience, the goal is not to turn bread into a fear food. The goal is to find the loaf that gives you the most useful version of ordinary. Something that tastes good enough. Something that fits the budget. Something that gives the meal some weight. Something that does not ask the label to do too much pretending. That is why I keep coming back to the same 3 questions. What is first? What is added? And what does the bread feel like when you actually eat it? If you can remember those 3 things, the whole aisle gets easier. Now let us get to the first loaf quickly. Number 9, Nature's Own Life Honey Wheat. This is one of the most important warning labels in the whole bread aisle because it sounds careful before it sounds healthy. Nature's Own Life Honey Wheat is the kind of loaf that talks to people who are already trying to be good. Smaller calories, soft texture, honey in the name, whole wheat in the story. It gives the shopper the feeling that the decision has already been made in a responsible way. But the ingredient list tells you something different. The bread starts with water, then wheat flour, then cellulose, wheat gluten, whole wheat flour, honey, sugar, and only later the smaller ingredients that keep the loaf behaving like soft bread. That is not the same thing as a hearty whole grain loaf. It is a designed loaf. It is built to be light, soft, and easy to eat while still looking like a careful choice. For older adults, that matters because a very soft bread can disappear fast at breakfast and still leave you wanting something else a little later. If you are using bread as the base for protein, fat, or a more filling meal, this is not the strongest place to start. It is a bread that behaves like a compromise. And in grocery shopping, compromises are often where the label gets most clever. There is also a reason the word honey feels so useful here. Honey sounds natural, makes the loaf feel less like processed bread, and more like a simple kitchen choice. But a comforting word in the name does not automatically give the bread more grain power. That is the habit this whole video is trying to build. Do not let the emotional word carry the nutritional load. Let the ingredient list do that. Number 8. Wonder 100% whole wheat. Wonder is famous for softness. That is not a criticism. That is the brand identity. For decades, Wonder has been the bread people think of when they think of light, fluffy, easy bread. So when the same brand puts whole wheat on the bag, the shopper gets a very powerful combination. Comfort from the old brand, health signal from the new label. That is why the loaf deserves a close look. The current label shows 13 grams of whole grain per slice, 2 grams of fiber, and 60 calories. That sounds neat on paper, but the loaf is still built to feel soft, light, and familiar. That is the point. Wonder is not trying to be a gritty, chewy grain bread. It is trying to be the soft bread people already know, now with a whole wheat label on it. That does not make it bad bread. It makes it a familiar soft bread with a healthier label. That is a real difference. If you want a bread that still tastes like the Wonder you remember, this may fit. If you want a loaf that gives your breakfast more grain identity and more chew, this is not the top-shelf answer. For some older adults, that softness is not a flaw. It is actually the whole reason the bread works. If you have a sensitive bite, if you want toast that does not fight you, or if you are buying for someone who simply will not eat a dense loaf, Wonder can still serve a purpose. The key is to know what job it is doing. It is the easy bread. It is not the strongest grain bread. Those are different jobs, and a good grocery decision starts by admitting that difference out loud. Number 7. Sara Lee Classic 100% Whole Wheat Bread. Sara Lee is one of those names that feels calm. The brand has been around long enough that many people stop reading once they see it. That is exactly what makes it dangerous as a default. The current label is not pretending to be something else. It does say whole wheat flour first. It does have 3 grams of fiber per 2 slices and 6 grams of protein. It even gives you 26 grams of whole grain per serving, which is respectable. But it also gives you 230 milligrams of sodium per 2 slices and 2 grams of added sugar. That is not tiny. For an older adult who is making breakfast toast or a sandwich every day, those numbers stack quietly. The loaf is still soft. It is still easy to bite. It still tastes like comfort. That is the whole point. The company wants whole wheat to feel like a simple upgrade without asking the customer to change the experience too much. If you are buying this loaf because you want a soft sandwich bread that feels familiar, I understand the appeal. If you are buying it because you think whole wheat automatically means the most useful bread for daily breakfast, I would slow down. This is also the kind of loaf that gets treated like a background food. People make a sandwich, eat it quickly, and never think about the bread again. But when bread becomes a background food every day, the background still matters. It is part of the routine, and routines are where small nutrition differences become real. If you are eating bread at breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner, then the bread is not a side note anymore. It is a habit. And habits deserve more than a glance. Number 6. Kroger 100% whole wheat bread. This is where budget bread becomes a label, reading problem. Kroger's loaf is the kind of bread many households buy because the price matters and the pantry has to keep moving. That is a real constraint. I respect it, but the cheapest loaf in the cart, the current Kroger still deserves shows whole wheat flour first, then water, sugar, yeast, vital wheat gluten, molasses, soybean oil, salt, sodium stearoyl lactylate, ammonium sulfate, calcium propionate, and fumaric acid. That is a lot of support work for a bread that is trying to act like a straightforward whole wheat loaf. The nutrition numbers also tell the story plainly enough. 2 slices can bring 290 milligrams of sodium, 3 grams of fiber, and 2 grams of added sugar, so the bread is not a disaster. It is simply not a dense, rustic, lower ingredient loaf just because it says whole wheat. For older adults on fixed incomes, this matters because a bargain loaf can feel like the sensible choice and still be more processed than it looked from the aisle. If your main question is cost, this loaf makes sense. If your main question is grain quality and daily satiety, it is still a soft supermarket loaf with a budget face on it. That is the same hidden trade-off that shows up all over the middle of the bread aisle. The loaf is cheap enough to feel safe. It is familiar enough to feel harmless. And it is soft enough to feel easy. That combination is exactly why many people never upgrade. The bread never offends them. It also never surprises them. And sometimes that is the most expensive part. Because a loaf that never challenges your habits can sit in the cart for years while a better bread option never gets tried. Reader check number 1. Look at the first ingredient. If whole wheat flour is not first, stop and think. If whole wheat flour is first, but the loaf still needs sugar, gluten, oil, and a long support list to stay soft, then you are looking at a soft sandwich bread, not a serious grain loaf. That is the first habit I want viewers to build. Not fear. Just reading. If this breakdown is helping, tap like and subscribe to Golden Menu now. We are going to make the next 30 minutes useful. Number 5. Great value 100% whole wheat bread. This is the budget version of the same conversation. Walmart? Its current page makes the promise very clear. Soft. Delicious. Freshly baked. Perfect for sandwiches, burgers, and toast. That sounds great, and in a way it is exactly the kind of bread many families need. The current label shows whole wheat flour first, with sugar, wheat gluten, yeast, and then the smaller ingredients that keep the loaf soft and shelf-stable. The nutrition panel is friendly too. 60 calories per slice, 110 milligrams of sodium, and 2 grams of fiber. That is not a bad everyday loaf in the abstract. The warning is that the word whole wheat can make the bread feel more powerful than it is. This loaf is a value loaf. That is the right frame for it. It is built to be affordable, soft, and easy to use. It is not built to be the most grain-dense choice in the store. For older adults, that distinction matters, because price and health are not the same category. You can absolutely buy this bread and make a decent breakfast with it. But if you are trying to move toward a loaf that actually feels more substantial, this is still closer to white bread logic than most people think. That is not an insult. It is just a category check. This is where a lot of good intentions get flattened by the shelf. Somebody starts with white bread for years. Then they decide whole wheat sounds smarter. Then they choose the lowest price whole wheat on the shelf and feel done. That is progress, but only part of it. The bread can still be soft enough to disappear fast and mild enough to hide inside the rest of the meal. If that is what you want, fine. Just do not mistake it for the bread that will hold you the longest or give you the most grain character. Budget does not have to mean bad. It only has to mean honest. Number 4. Pepperidge Farm Farmhouse 100% whole wheat. This is one of the more elegant traps in the bread aisle. Pepperidge Farm knows how to make a loaf feel careful. The packaging feels more slower and better. The slices are larger and the branding feels more grown up than a plain supermarket bag. That is precisely why shoppers stop questioning it. But the current label is busy. Whole wheat flour first. Then water, sugar, wheat gluten, soybean oil, molasses, oat fiber, monoglycerides, preservatives, sodium stearoyl lactylate, soy lecithin, whey, citric acid, and butter. And the nutrition facts show what that formula buys you. 180 milligrams of sodium, 4 grams of fiber, and 4 grams of added sugar per slice. That is a lot of engineering for a loaf that looks like it came from a slower kitchen. If you are older and you like a soft sandwich bread that still has some fiber, this may be pleasant, but pleasant is not the same thing as the best everyday bread. The farmhouse name is doing emotional work. The ingredient list is doing industrial work. That is what makes this loaf so easy to trust and so worth checking. Premium bread often sells itself through mood. The bag looks calmer, the name sounds slower, the loaf feels like it belongs near a nicer knife or a nicer breakfast table. But none of that changes the reality that the product is still engineered to sit on a shelf, stay soft, and taste reliable to a wide range of shoppers. The more polished the packaging becomes, the more likely a careful buyer is to stop reading. That is why premium brands can be even trickier than budget brands. The cheap loaf at least tells you it is cheap. The premium loaf can make you feel like you already know enough. Reader check number 2. Ask yourself this question. Does the bread have more fiber than sugar, or does it just have a healthy-looking name? For a lot of supermarket whole wheat loaves, the answer is more complicated than the packaging suggests. That is why I like making this check explicit. It saves people from letting the front panel do all the thinking. And it gives older viewers a better way to compare loaves without memorizing brand names. You do not need to remember every marketing trick. You only need to remember that fiber should earn its place. Sugar should not be hiding in the front of the line, and softness usually means the loaf had help. That simple check works on almost every supermarket bread. Number 3. Oro wheat, 100% whole wheat. Oro wheat sits in the aisle, like the responsible choice. The name sounds a little more premium. The bag tends to look a little more mature. And that can make the loaf feel like a more serious bread than the basic value options. The current label does include whole wheat flour first, but it also includes bulgur wheat, sugar, vegetable oil, wheat gluten, whole wheat, honey, yeast, sea salt, natural flavors, fermented wheat flour, grain vinegar, soy lecithin, citric acid, soy, and whey. That is a good example of how a loaf can feel wholesome, while still being built for softness and consistency. The nutrition facts are also pretty ordinary for a soft bread. 110 calories, 160 milligrams of sodium, 3 grams of fiber, and 3 grams of sugar per slice. Again, not terrible, just not the big grain upgrade the front of the bag can imply. If you want a sandwich bread that is a little more substantial and a little less flimsy, Oro wheat can work. If you want the kind of bread that makes you chew a little more and gives the meal more structure, there are better choices later in the video. This is a useful example of the middle shelf problem. The middle shelf is where many grocery shoppers live. Not the cheapest loaf, not the specialty loaf. Just the loaf that feels responsible enough to buy again. That middle is where the most convincing brands live, because they do not need to be amazing. They only need to be good enough to stop the comparison process. And once comparison stops, the shopper starts buying the brand, not the bread. That is what a long-running bread habit can become if you never slow down and ask what the loaf is actually doing. Brownberry whole grains, 100% whole wheat. Brownberry is a regional trust brand. That is what makes it so easy to overlook. People who grew up with it often assume the brand has already done the hard part. But the label still needs reading. The current product page on Instacart shows 3 grams of sugar, 160 milligrams of sodium, and a whole wheat bread that is still presented as soft and everyday. That alone tells you the main thing. This is not a dense, seed-heavy, chewy bread. It is a familiar, soft, daily sandwich loaf that uses whole wheat to sound more careful than white bread. That can be useful. It can also be misleading if you are shopping by memory instead of by label. For older adults, regional comfort is a powerful thing. If a bread has always been in the pantry, the brain tends to stop asking for proof. That is the habit this video is trying to break gently. Not by telling you to fear bread, by telling you to read the bread. Brownberry is also a good reminder that brand trust and grain quality are not the same thing. A bread can be familiar, steady, and perfectly fine for an ordinary meal. It can also still be a soft bread that depends on that familiarity to win the shelf. When a brand has years of trust behind it, the customer often gives it a pass that a newer label would never receive. That is normal. It is also why people end up buying the same loaf for years without asking whether a better one is sitting 2 feet away. Number 1. Nature's Own 100% whole wheat. This is the one that looks the most honest and still deserves scrutiny. Nature's Own 100% whole wheat is a good example of why a cleaner ingredient list still does not automatically mean a grain-forward loaf. The company says it has no artificial preservatives, colors, or flavors, no high fructose corn syrup, and 13 grams of whole grain per serving. That all sounds good. And to be fair, it is better than many older bread formulas. But the ingredients still start with whole wheat flour, water, yeast, brown sugar, and wheat gluten, followed by the small ingredients that help the loaf stay soft and pleasant for a long time. It also comes in as a very soft bread, with only 2 grams of fiber per slice. That is the key number for me. The bread is better than the worst loaf in the aisle. It is not the same as the strongest loaf in the aisle. That is the distinction older adults need to hear over and over until it becomes automatic. Better than white bread is not the same thing as worth building your daily breakfast around. That sentence is one of the most important in the whole video. Because once you accept it, you stop making bread decisions in a hurry. You stop treating whole wheat like a finish line. You start treating it like a category that still needs inspection. That shift alone can change what goes into the cart for the next year. And for a daily food, that matters more than a one-time upgrade ever could. Now let us pause for reader check number 3. Look at sodium and softness together. A very soft loaf often needs more support from sugar, oil, gluten, or preservatives to keep the texture stable. That does not make the bread unsafe. It just means the loaf is being engineered to behave a certain way. If you understand that, a lot of label confusion goes away. If the first 9 breads were the soft side of the aisle, the next 3 are the stronger answers. Not perfect, just more honest about the grain. That does not mean everyone needs to move immediately to the heaviest or driest loaf in the store. Older adults still need bread that fits their teeth, their habits, their budget, and the rest of the meal. So the good picks are not here because they are trendy. They are here because they give you more grain value without asking you to play word games with the label. Best option number 3. Dave's Killer Bread, 21 whole grains and seeds. If you want the bread to stay in the background and let the meal do the work, the thin sliced format matters. Older adults often want toast or a sandwich without turning the bread itself into the main event. This loaf handles that well. The current product page says 60 calories, 3 grams of fiber, 3 grams of protein, and 12 grams of whole grains per slice. The ingredient list begins with organic whole wheat and water, then organic cane sugar, then the long mix of grains and seeds. That tells you 2 useful things. First, it is still bread. There is sugar in there. Second, it is grain, forward bread. Not a soft imitation of grain. You can taste the texture. You can feel the chew. You can build a sandwich on it without losing the grain identity. That is why I would put it on the better list. It is easy to find. It works for toast. It gives you a better grain story than most supermarket whole wheat loaves. It also works well for older adults who want the bread to stay out of the way. If you are eating eggs, peanut butter, cheese, tuna, or a simple sandwich filling, the thin slice keeps the meal from getting too heavy. That is a useful kind of bread. Not flashy, just useful. And that is part of its strength. A lot of bread marketing is built around excitement. This loaf is built around usefulness. That matters more than people think, especially when the bread is not the star of the plate. If you want toast that supports coffee, a lunch sandwich that does not feel oversized, or a slice that gives you grain without making breakfast feel heavy, this is a very practical pick. It is the kind of bread you can live with for a long time without getting tired of the label or confused by the recipe. Best option number 2, Silver Hills, the Big 16. This is the loaf I would point to if someone wanted a more substantial sandwich bread with real structure. Silver Hills does not pretend that sprouted grain bread is the same thing as soft, white bread with wheat coloring. The Big 16 is loaded with 16 seeds and grains and is one of their most popular sprouted power breads for a reason. The current page shows 43 grams of whole grains per 2, slice serving, 12 grams of protein, 8 grams of fiber, and 200 milligrams of omega-3 ALA. That is a lot of work from one bread. The ingredient story is also straightforward for this category. Sprouted grains, water, whole grains and seeds, vital wheat gluten, sugars, yeast, cultured wheat flour, sea salt, enzymes, and ascorbic acid. That is not a soft sandwich loaf pretending to be healthy. It is a grain, rich loaf that knows exactly what it is. For older adults, that matters because a bread with more chew and more seed texture can change how the whole meal feels. It gives the sandwich some weight. It makes toast feel like food instead of packaging. And it is better for people who want the bread to support the meal rather than disappear under the toppings. It is also the kind of loaf that rewards slower eating. That is not a small thing for this audience. If you are sitting down with coffee, a book, or the morning news, a denser bread can naturally slow the pace of breakfast. That slower pace can make the meal feel more complete. Sometimes the best upgrade is not a nutritional trick. Sometimes it is a bread that forces you to eat like you mean it. That can be especially useful for older adults who want lunch to feel like a meal instead of a quick snack with bread around it. A seed-rich loaf can hold up better under egg salad, tuna, turkey, avocado, or a bowl of soup. It does not melt into the background. It stays present. For some people, that is exactly what makes the meal feel more satisfying. For others, it may be a little much. That is fine too. The point is not that every person needs the densest loaf. The point is that the bread should match the way you actually eat. Best option number 1. Food for Life Ezekiel, chapter 4, verse 9. Original, cleanest whole grain answer for most people in this aisle. Not because it is magical. Not because bread suddenly became a health food. But because the ingredient story is far more honest than the average grocery loaf. Organic sprouted wheat. Filtered water. Organic sprouted barley. Organic sprouted millet. Organic malted barley. Organic sprouted lentils. Organic sprouted soybeans. Organic sprouted spelt. Organic wheat gluten. Yeast. Sea salt. That is the recipe. It is a very different idea from soft supermarket wheat bread. This loaf is built around sprouted grains and legumes instead of the usual soft bread logic. It is also the kind of loaf many shoppers keep frozen and pull out as needed, which changes the way the bread is handled and stored. The loaf does not need to stay soft for weeks on a shelf. It does not need the same preservative strategy. It does not need to behave like a sandwich cushion. It can just be bread. And that plain fact is part of why it wins here. Older adults who like a more grounded breakfast often want food that feels real from the first bite. This loaf gives you that. It is firmer. It is nuttier. It asks you to chew a little more. That can be a benefit if you want breakfast to feel more complete and less like a quick carbohydrate hit. It also has a built-in honesty that many soft breads do not have. There is no need to pretend it is light, airy, or bakery fluffy. It is not trying to imitate a white loaf. It is trying to be a sprouted grain bread, and it succeeds on its own terms. And for a lot of older adults, that is the whole appeal. The flavor is nuttier. The chew is firmer. The ingredient list is short enough to respect. It is a good bread if you want the bread itself to feel like part of the health decision, not just the thing holding the filling together. If you want the strongest bread to use for breakfast toast, for a simple sandwich, or for a daily routine that feels more grounded, this is the one I would start with. This is also the loaf most likely to divide opinions. Some people will love it right away. Some people will take one bite and decide it is too dense, too nutty, or too serious for their taste. That is fine. The point of a better pick is not to become everybody's favorite food. The point is to be the bread that most clearly does the job without pretending to be something else. And this loaf does that better than almost anything else in the aisle. Here is the practical shopping rule for the bread aisle. If the loaf is very soft, ask what had to happen to make it that way. If the first ingredient is not whole wheat flour or sprouted grain, slow down. If the bread claims whole wheat, but only gives you 2 grams of fiber, it may be more of a soft sandwich loaf than a grain loaf. If the added sugar is doing too much work, the loaf is trying to taste better than it is. If the sodium is high, remember that 2 slices is only the start of the meal. And if a bread looks healthy because it is brown, that is the exact moment to read again. Bread is still bread. Portions still matter. What you put on top still matters. But the best loaf is the one that gives you the clearest answer before you buy it. That is what makes it easier to keep on buying the right thing week after week. If you are buying for yourself, use the loaf that supports the meal you actually eat. If you are buying for a spouse, use the loaf they will really finish. If you are buying for an older parent, use the bread they can chew comfortably and still trust after reading the label. That is how a bread guide becomes useful in the real world. Not by sounding strict. By helping the same good choice happen again tomorrow. If you want the easiest version of this system, do not try to memorize every brand. Pick one bread that works for comfort and one bread that works for grain. Use the soft loaf when the day calls for easy toast, quick sandwiches, or a bite that does not ask much when you want breakfast or lunch to feel more complete. Then keep applying the same 3 checks every time you shop. First ingredient: fiber and sugar, sodium and softness. That is enough to keep most people out of trouble in the bread aisle. And if you are shopping for an older parent, that same rule matters even more. Do not buy the bread that only sounds healthy. Buy the bread they will actually finish. A good loaf that gets eaten is better than a perfect loaf that goes stale in the kitchen. That is one of the quiet truths of real-life grocery shopping. The best choice is not always the most impressive one. It is the one that fits the household and shows up again next week. For toast, I would lean toward Dave's Killer Bread or Ezekiel. For a more substantial sandwich, Silver Hills holds up well. For a familiar soft loaf, some of the middle-tier breads may still be fine, but now you know exactly what they are doing. That is the power of reading the label instead of trusting the color. And that is really the whole channel idea in one sentence. Most grocery decisions do not change your life in one bite. They change your week through repetition. A soft loaf repeated every morning is different from a denser loaf used a few times a week. A bargain bread that never gets questioned can shape the routine of the whole household. And a stronger bread that feels a little more substantial can quietly make breakfast or lunch more satisfying without much extra effort. That is why I wanted this list to be more than a brand dump. The point is not to memorize names. The point is to build a habit. Once the habit is there, every future bread aisle becomes easier. You do not have to trust the front of the bag. You do not have to guess from the color. You do not have to assume that whole wheat means the same thing in every loaf. You just read the 3 checks, choose the best fit for the person eating it, and move on with your day. If this video helped, leave a comment with the bread brand you want checked next. And if you want more grocery breakdowns that help you shop smarter after 60, subscribe to Golden Menu. The front of the bag sells comfort. The label decides whether the bread earned it.